The Royal Artillery was quickly depleting its ammunition. Chief Engineer Brigadier Simpson warned that Singapore City would run out of water within a day. Bennett and Heath had been advocating for surrender for several days at this point. Consequently, it was decided to accept the surrender terms proposed by Yamashita 4 days earlier. Suddenly, Bennett suggested a joint attack to reclaim Bukit Timah, but his proposal was met with pure silence from the rest. A Japanese flag was displayed for 10 minutes from the Cathay building, signaling that Percival had agreed to Yamashita's terms and he would meet him at the Ford factory. Yamashita's forces at this time were critically low on weapons, ammunition, and food. He had only 18 tanks remaining. His infantry was instructed to limit each soldier to just 100 rounds. Fuel supplies had dwindled to the point that resources between Singapore and Johor had completely run out, forcing the men to survive on 2 bowls of rice per day. It's pretty notable. So, Percival arrived at about 4:30 p.m. to the Ford factory carrying a white flag himself. Inside the building was full of clamoring reporters, photographers, and newsreelsmen. Yamashita appeared and he said this: "The Japanese army will consider nothing but surrender." Yamashita knew despite everything, the British still outnumbered him 3-1, and he was gravely concerned they would soon figure it out. Percival stated, "I fear that we shall not be able to submit our final reply before 10:30 p.m. Yamashita was livid. The man was stalling because he must realize the numerical inferiority of Yamashita's forces. Street fighting would lead to an absolute disaster. So he said, "Reply to us whether our terms are acceptable or not. Things must be settled swiftly. We are prepared to resume firing." Percival continued to stall, stating, "Unless you do surrender, we will carry out our..." Sorry, Yamashita stated this to Percival. "Unless you do surrender, we will carry out our night attack as scheduled." Percival stated, "Cannot the Japanese army remain in its present position? We can resume negotiations again tomorrow at 5:30 a.m. Yamashita said, "Nani, I want the hostilities to cease tonight. I want to remind you there could be no arguments." Percival stated, "We shall discontinue firing by 8:30 p.m., but we better remain in our present positions tonight?" This is a question. Yamashita told him to do so, but he was suspicious of Percival's vague manner, and he blurted out, "You have to agree to the terms, but you have not yet." He said, "You have agreed to the terms, but you have not yet made yourself clear as to whether you agree to surrender or not." Percival, unable to speak, because of course this was the worst military disaster Britain had faced in its military history almost, he cleared his throat and he nodded. The exasperated Yamashita told his interpreter he wanted the British to give him a simple answer, and he looked at his watch, shaking his finger at him. "There's no need for all this talk. It is a simple question. I want a simple answer. We want to hear from you. Yes or no, do you surrender? Surrender or fight?" He shouted at Percival. Percival said, "Yes, I agree. I have a request to make. Will the Japanese army protect the women and children and British civilians?" To this, Yamashita said, "We shall see to it. Please sign this truce agreement." Actually, many quote that he says we're not barbarians, but it's not true. He didn't say that. Yeah, so with that, Percival had surrendered. It was the greatest land victory in Japanese history. They had proved to their Asian brethren that the white man could be defeated. Yamashita took Malaya and Singapore for 3,506 killed, 6,150 wounded. Percival's estimates were about 7,500 killed and 10,000 wounded. About 120,000 prisoners were taken. Yeah. During the Singapore Island campaign, Yamashita lost almost as many men as the entire Malayan campaign. There was about 1,713 killed and nearly 3,000 wounded. Yamashita afterwards would love to boast, after, it was probably his greatest victory, that it was all done on a bluff. Because he was greatly outnumbered, he had run completely out of artillery shells, he had nothing left. And this is a quote from Yamashita himself. "My attack on Singapore was a bluff that worked. I had 30,000 men. I was outnumbered, more than 3-1. I knew that if I had to fight for long for Singapore, I would have been beaten. This is why the surrender had to be at once. I was very frightened all the time that the British would discover our numerical weakness, and lack of supplies and forced me into disastrous street fighting.
I think that's a fair assumption,
Yeah.
or from his point of view.
On paper, it is true. He was outnumbered 3-1, but his three first-class homogeneous divisions were backed up by air and naval superiority, and you can't really compare it to Percival's loose command of different units who were greatly demoralized. If the British had continued to resist, the worst would have happened, but in the end, Yamashita, he would have had to wait for reinforcements and supplies. His victory wouldn't have been as grand.
Not to
British,
mention that would have actually diminished his standings in the Imperial Army by a huge
yeah,
blow.
and it would have screwed up the scheduling for many other places. But ironically, I don't know if I can get into it here. Yamashita did this campaign so fast, it actually screwed up the scheduling because they didn't know like exactly what to do with the units. The fall of Singapore on February the 15th stupefied Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill. He would imagine like how could over 100,000 men, half of them being British, mind you, hold up their hands to surrender to the what he would call the inferior numbers of the Japanese. He had been prepared for the fall, but the surrender of the fortress had simply stunned him. He felt it was an absolute disgrace, and in his words, it left a scar on my mind. One evening, months later, when I was sitting in my bathroom enveloped in a towel, I stopped drying myself and I gloomily surveyed the floor. I cannot get over Singapore. When most people think of the start of World War II, they envision, the German invasion of Poland in 1939. Others may refer, excuse me, I was about to read something I put for notes for another episode. Excuse me there. Ironic that I had accidentally put this in this Google Doc. But yeah,
But
that is,
perhaps I'd just add two things, like the aftermath of two generals that we talked about in the early part of the
yeah.
episode. So Brigadier Paris, he did not want to quit fighting, so he planned an escape and he boarded the Dutch ship Rosenboom. And luckily his wife had escaped for him, but he was sunk off the coast of Sumatra.
Mm,
Around 80 passengers, including himself, were the survivors on one lifeboat.
jeez.
And he would die over the next 28 days with most of them, as only 5 people survived, because it was 28 days before the survivors were found.
Oof.
It was quite a thing. And on the other hand, General Gordon Bennett, he said it was his duty to continue the fight. And well before the surrender, where Percival went to meet Yamashita, he boarded a transport and escaped. Initially, when he returned, he was greeted as a hero because it was some kind of like, I guess, positivity to cheer for in the background of a great disaster.
Yeah.
And, you know, even like the Prime Minister of Australia, John Curtin, issued a statement that read, I desire to inform the nation that we are proud to pay tribute to the efficiency, gallantry, and devotion of our forces throughout the struggle. We have expressed to Major General Bennett our confidence in him. His leadership and conduct were in complete conformity with his duty to the men under his command and to his country. He remained with his men until the end, completed all formalities in connection with the surrender, and then took the opportunity and risk of escaping. However, while the politicians, civilians might have liked it, the higher ups of the Australian military did not. And he was quite criticized for leaving his troops. And anyway, I can see why that would happen.
Yeah.
On April 1942, he was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General and given command of the Third Corps in Perth, which at the time, as the Japanese were advancing through New Guinea, it was seen as a pretty important position.
Yeah.
And by 1943, with the threat of the invasion at an absolute zero, Thomas Blamey, who's now commander in chief, just tells him point blank, you're not going to get anything. They forcefully put him in the reserve officers list. He tries to, fight published an account of why Singapore fell, where he's critical of the British and Percival, and several Australian officers who served in that campaign challenge his views.
Hmm.
So he does have a pretty uh, controversial return in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I would say so. It's definitely the worst humiliation I think the British would be served during World War II. Um, there was nothing that Percival really could do in the end. It was just how long were you going to stall out the siege, really? Could he have maybe gone on another month, perhaps? In the grand scheme of things, it would have maybe set the Japanese back. It would have blemished Yamashita's career even more, even though afterwards, Yamashita's going to, of course, he's going to do a few more things, but Hideki Tojo is going to put him right back in exile in Manchuria and not pull him out till like the very end of the war to sacrifice him in the Philippines. But yeah.
And the while Percival does deserve a lot of criticism for the way he handled the campaign, he didn't like throughout the Malaysian campaign, he did not show decisiveness. He panicked, and obviously his intelligence pictures failed him, which was a stark contrast to his decisive and intelligence gathering in combating the IRA, for example. I can't fully blame him because the quality of his soldiers was pretty much like raw and Green's troops.
Yeah.
He did try his best to start training them, but as the British Army did expand, they had to dilute the officer pool.
Yeah.
So it was left with even fewer capable officers.
Yeah, he was kind of doomed from the very end. But that is the end of Singapore. And this is also the end of our Malayan
I
campaign.
mean,
So before I let the audience go, I just want to say again, if you'd like to further support this channel, please think about joining the YouTube membership or the Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Excuse me. And again, I'll say it here. It's about 20 something plus episodes that are behind that paywall. And the first episode in a multi-part series, which is an alternate history of the Pacific War. And by no means is it how Japan would win World War II. That's not the purpose of it. It's well researched. It took me a long time to start writing. The first episode is titled The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor. And I think a lot of people will be very entertained by it, especially those who know their Pacific War history. I really went out of my way on this one. But again, Garov, thank you so much for being part of this.
and
And
thanks. My pleasure.
soon we're going to be jumping into something completely different.
Well, let's leave it for the audience that the next few episodes are definitely going to be one-off episodes
Hmm.
all across the timeline.
Yep.
I'm not going to say anything more.
Okay. And until next time.